This morning, we're going to begin a 4-week series oriented around the Christmas season, kind of the Christmas holiday time. And as excited as many of us get around this time of year, there is a peril as it relates to preaching about Christmas or even talking about Christmas at this time of year. And the peril has to do really with one word, and the word is familiarity. In fact, I think a lot of us in the room probably know the old saying that familiarity breeds what? Contempt, right? Familiarity breeds contempt. And that's an idea that basically says we become so familiar with, or we become so adjusted to, or we get so used to a place or an idea or a person or a season that we lose sight of its uniqueness. We lose sight of its meaning, and actually contempt begins to replace any sense of value that we might have for it. And so familiarity can breed contempt. It can do this. And I think we look at Christmas, the peril of Christmas is not the busyness. I know everyone says, oh, you're so busy this time of year, there's so many things going on. And the peril of Christmas is not the consumerism and the shopping and all the stuff. I really believe the peril of Christmas is familiarity. That somehow we've come to a point where we celebrate Christmas with about the same enthusiasm. We understand that we see the significance about the same as we see Valentine's Day or Thanksgiving. Like we're honoring Jesus like we honor the pilgrims or our Valentine. Like there's sort of that much effort given to this. And the only explanation that I can come up with is that we've gotten so used to the story. We've heard it so many times. It's been something that's been repeated over and over again. We get so used to it that we actually lose the plot. We're used to the story, and so we lose the plot of the story, if that's even possible. And so for the next few weeks, I just want to challenge the numbness that might be growing in our own hearts towards this season, and specifically towards what is the most powerful moment in human history. And I want us to recapture the awe that's associated with that, and for us to begin to explore one word that's found in one passage, in one gospel, one time. That's what we're going to talk about the next 4 weeks, the implications of that, because this word changes everything. It is scandalous. It is absolutely, it is subversive. It's shocking. And what's also interesting is it's a word you already know, but you're familiar with it. And so it doesn't seem so shocking, and it doesn't seem so scandalous. And so I want us to just begin in the beginning. I want you to open your Bible this morning to Matthew chapter 1. We're going to start reading in verse 18. We figure, hey, if we're going to do a series on the Christmas story, how about if we start with the birth of Jesus? There's a thought, right? So let's start there and maybe see what this says. So if you don't have a Bible, the words are on the screen and you can just follow along there. But it says this. It says, now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Immanuel. You shall call his name Immanuel. Now, here's what's fascinating about this name. It's only mentioned 3 times in the entire Bible. Old Testament and New Testament, only 3 times. Only 1 time in the New Testament, and it's right here where we just read. The only time this word ever comes up is where we just read it in the New Testament. Which means this is an incredibly rare name. Immanuel. This is a unique word, which is really interesting because think about how familiar you are with it. Like, get around Christmas, we sing songs about Immanuel. You even go to department stores, and they've got Immanuel. Immanuel stuff is everywhere. Like, Immanuel becomes this thing that we're very used to, and yet when you look at it in the scriptures, it is incredibly distinct and unique. So before this, when it appears in the Old Testament, it appears 2 times, and it's in reference to a child that was being born during the reign of King Ahaz, and this child that was being born was a sign to Judah, to the nation of Judah, that they would receive relief from the persecution and challenges from nations outside of their borders. So the name, Immanuel, symbolizes the fact that God is going to demonstrate his presence with the people in such a powerful way that they would be delivered. In other words, like God's presence is going to be so known among them that when other people look and go, what's the deal with you guys? The only explanation will be, well, God must be with you. So Immanuel is this idea that whatever God is doing is so powerful that it can only be explained by him being among you. Immanuel, God with us. Immanuel, God with us. So what this is an assurance. It's a promise, or it's a blessing that's being spoken over the people from God, who is saying, I am with you. That's this name, Immanuel. So when we come to the birth of Jesus, and this angel approaches Joseph, and he has this moment where he kind of talks him out of backing out of the marriage, and then he says there's a name for this child, and then Matthew references this prophet that speaks of Immanuel. This is not a name that is just simply being passed down like some great uncle's middle name that we have to keep going. This is an incredibly unique name that defines the very essence of who this child is and all that he represents. This is God with us. He is God. And his presence is a profound statement about the posture that God has towards humanity. Just the fact that he's here says something about how God feels about people. God with us. God is present with us. I don't know if you've been downtown. Anybody love downtown around the Christmas season? You guys like? Spokane's amazing. I love going downtown, and the other night I was kind of doing some stuff downtown, and I was walking, and it was just like one of those times when like the lights are on all the trees, and the road was glistening, and like people were out shopping, and it was like everyone was whistling. It was like this, it's like It's a Wonderful Life, but in color. I was like, it's in 3D, this is amazing, you know? And I'm down there, and I actually said to myself, it just feels like Christmas. It just feels like Christmas, and I was kind of excited. Then I thought about it, and I thought, am I saying that because I'm aware of the presence of Immanuel, God with us? Or am I saying that because of the nostalgia that has been drummed up around this commercialized holiday? I'm going to confess, it was the latter, right? It was the trees, and it was the glistening road, and the people out shopping. That's what made me feel that, right? But when we talk about Immanuel, what we should be saying when we say it feels like Christmas is, I'm aware of the presence of God because Immanuel, God is with us. That is the feeling that's associated with this event, the presence of God. Kind of imagine it this way. Imagine like a movie scene where there's a group of people and they're all arriving at a house to celebrate somebody, right? A birthday or whatever it might be. And as they come into the house, they're carrying gifts and they're carrying food and they're coming in and they're seeing each other, and the house gets more and more full, and people are sharing stories and they're reconnecting, and you can just imagine the volume going up. And then imagine a little later in the scene, the camera kind of backs away and pans away from the people and then moves out into the backyard, and there outside is the guest of honor who at some point during the party needed some fresh air and wandered out, and nobody inside is aware that he's left the building. That's sort of how I feel about Christmas. Like there's this party, but are we celebrating the one we call Immanuel? He is with us, but are we with him? Maybe it's time we refocused on what all of this is about. Which is why I want to answer the question, what does it mean to be with us? What does it mean that God is with us? And in order to do this, in order to answer this question, I want to take a few minutes and I want to talk about the three words that we have to use to define this. So Immanuel, one word in our language, is God with us, and so I want to talk about God with and us, those words independently. And so first, let's talk about God for just a moment. And when we talk about God, I want you just to think for just a second. What do you think when you think about God? When you think about God, what are the kinds of things you think about? And I don't mean like in this very sterile environment in here, right? You're like, well, I think really good things about God when I'm at church, right? Right? Not where we've all been kind of cleaned up and we've sang songs about building our life on His love. It's a firm foundation. Not that kind of thinking, but like Wednesday thinking. What do you think about God? Right? When you're driving in your car, when you're at work, when you're facing struggle, when you think about God, what are your thoughts about or surrounding God? I mean, this Immanuel is an announcement about God by God, but I think before we listen to what he's saying, we have to consider how we think about God. When you hear those letters together form the word God, what do you think about? What is your experience with God? What's the emotions? What are the impressions? What are the opinions that you have? What are your experiences with God? That's an important question for us to answer because the way that we think about God influences the way we relate to God. Does that make sense? Like how you think about God is going to shape the way you relate to God. It's kind of like people and their dogs. You notice that when you look at somebody with their dog, a person's dog tells you something about a person, right? You notice this? In fact, some dogs look like their owners. Have you noticed that too? It's weird. Like some people get dogs that look like themselves. I don't know what that means, but you know how you look at a person and you like see their dog, you're like, oh, I think I know something about you because of that. Which, like, I don't know what that means about me. I never analyze myself this way. I have 2 dogs. One of them is the ugliest dog on the planet, seriously. And then the other dog's really pretty, so I guess I'm just somewhere in the middle, right? But dogs tell us something about people, but in the same way, your God tells me something about you. The way you think about God tells me something about you and your values and what you find important. There's something about the way you think that impacts the way you relate to God. So how do you think about God when you think about God, when you talk about God? As you can imagine, I probably have a few more conversations on this subject than the average person. It's like an occupational hazard of mine. And I regularly have conversations with people who are less sure and they're trying to figure things out on this subject. In fact, sometimes they're trying to sort out whether or not they believe God exists at all. And so I have these conversations. And whenever I'm talking about how we think about God, there's usually some other terminology that I'll use to talk about the way we think of God. In fact, there's 4 ways that we historically or philosophically think about God as human beings throughout human history. And I just want to share these with you because it kind of helps frame the conversation for us. The first way we talk about God is God as a being. The second is God as a hyper being. The third is God as ground of being. And then the fourth is God as event. And so those are typically the 4 ways we talk about God. I'll just explain them real quickly. So God as a being, that basically means that God is man-shaped, right? That God looks like us and talks like us. And this is probably the more primitive way of viewing God. And sometimes we slip into this kind of thinking that we view God as he's seen in most mythologies, that he's kind of shaped like us and he's someplace off in the cosmos and he's got this big terminal with levers and buttons and he's kind of overseeing the universe from that location and he's very much a being, right? That's God as a being. In fact, most theologians have said that when we talk about God, we often are just talking about a bigger version of ourselves. That oftentimes, and for some people, God is just a bigger, slightly more powerful, and a little bit smarter version of who we are. Like if I was God, I'd be kind of like this, and we imagine God being a lot like us. So that's God as a being. We imagine God in that way. And so we'll think about God in that sort of way. Or we'll talk about God or think about God as what we would refer to as hyper-being. And in this view, we begin to recognize that God may be bigger than we can imagine. Or said this way, I can imagine that God is bigger than what I can imagine. Right? You start to go, okay, God's a being of some sort, but he's a being that goes beyond what I can imagine. So we can imagine that we can't imagine everything. Like at some point you admit your humility and say, I don't know everything, and especially about God, and so I'm going to accept the fact that there are unknown things I'll never know about this God. And so God is bigger than just a being. He's different than just a being. In fact, the mystics, they would say that you can't talk about God as some sort of dispassionate object because God is a reality that transforms you, that when you encounter God, you just have an experience and then you use words to describe your participation with that being, but those words don't nail him down. In other words, if you had a profound spiritual experience and you said, in order to memorialize this moment, in order to do something to honor this moment, I'm going to build a cathedral. If you're a really good architect, and you had this really profound moment, you're going to build a really beautiful cathedral, right? That says, oh man, look at this, and this is representative of this experience that I have. But let's say that you're a really bad architect, and you have the same spiritual experience with the same God, and you go to build your cathedral, it might be kind of a crummy little chapel, right? But the chapel and the cathedral, they're just expressions, they're responses to an experience with this God. In the same way, when you look at church history and you look at the history of people relating to God, you have brilliant people. You have people throughout the ages, Thomas Aquinas, brilliant people who have these encounters, and they architect with words these descriptions of what they've experienced with this God. And maybe we don't have the IQ, or maybe we don't have the vocabulary, but we all seem to be describing something that is a response to what's happening with this God. So that's what happens when you encounter God as this hyper being. You're expressing things. You're trying to understand things. This is why in the Bible there are multiple names of God, because one of the best ways to not name something is to give it all kinds of names. And so we use all of these names in order to say, well, God's very difficult for us to understand. He's beyond just a being that we can describe in simple words. That brings up ground of being. Basically, this means that God is that from which everything else arises. That's our understanding of God. This means that speech about God is just symbolic, because as soon as I say something about God, that turns me into a subject and him into an object. And ground of being would say that God becomes before subjects and objects. So as soon as we make God an object, we miss God because he's not an object. So God is that from which subjects and objects arise. I'm not going to spend any more time explaining this other than to say, in Acts chapter 17, I think this is what the Apostle Paul is alluding to, when he's in Athens and he borrows an inscription off of one of the Athenian statues there, and he says, speaking of the God of the universe, the God of Israel, he says, in him we live and we move and we have our being. There's this sense that God is bigger, larger, that everything is kind of rising out of whoever God is. God is ground of being. Then we come to God as event. And I know some of you are scratching your head and saying, what in the world is this? And one of the reasons I share this and oftentimes share it with people is that sometimes when somebody says, I'm not sure that God exists, I'll talk about historically how we have experienced God as event. And this is a bit harder to explain, but I'm going to use two words to define it: gravity and grace. So gravity exists, right? Can we all agree on that? That gravity exists, and there's nobody that's defying it these days, right? And our world follows natural laws like gravity, right? So the planets revolve, and predators eat their prey, and affliction is paid back with affliction, and suffering with suffering, and hatred with hatred, and violence with violence, and war with war. The fittest survive, and the weak die. The inadequate fade away. That's just a matter of the course. Things just move in this particular way. We can just call this gravity, right? There's just some laws that just exist, and they don't get defied. But then there is this grace. And somehow, peppered in the middle of the reality of this world with gravity, there is this grace that stops the cycle, that stops us from repaying violence with violence, or evil with evil, or hatred with hatred. And now we love and we bring peace. We break the cycle. It's something that is spread in the universe that makes us, instead of just being one-dimensional people who always do the same thing, there's something that says there's a different way to do this, and maybe we can lean into this and become better people. And so you might experience God as event through some sort of ultimate concern. You give yourself to a cause. You fight for justice for a particular thing. You give yourself in sacrificial love. And in one of those moments, there's this thing that you experience, and you're like, I'm more alive than I've ever felt ever before in my life. Like, there's something happening. Like, this moment is so powerful. Or you climb to the top of a mountain, and as you break through the trees, you see the view and the expanse out in front of you. And there's this little thing that we have a difficult time describing, but we use words like awe and wonder. In those moments, could we be experiencing God as event? Oftentimes, for people in my life who don't know if God exists, I ask them to describe what they're feeling on a mountaintop or in a moment of sacrificial service. What is it that is going on inside of you that you can't describe with words? So these are the ways that we think about God. We relate to God in all these ways as human beings. And so my question for you is, how do you think about God? How do you think about God? What is your experience like? See, even with all this, which some of you are like, this didn't help, we're left with some very nebulous definitions of who God is, aren't we? Which is where we discover the power of Matthew chapter 1. think for a moment about biblical encounters with God prior to this moment in Matthew chapter 1. I mean, you see, up until when Jesus enters the scene, you see that whenever God is present, like whenever God is on the scene, there's two basic things that people are experiencing: mystery and terror, right? Those are the two basic experiences. I mean, think about this. Like when God appears to Job, he appears as a whirlwind or a tornado. That's terrifying, right? I mean, how many times does a worship leader stand in church and say, God, we just invite your presence in here today? Well, not if it's a tornado, we don't, right? Like, that is a terrifying picture, and some people relate to God in that sort of way, right? Or he appears to Abraham, and this is a crazy image, as a furnace, like a flaming furnace that moves through two pieces of sliced meat. Strange dream that Abraham has, really mysterious and crazy. Like, what is that all about? To the people of Israel, he's a column of smoke and a column of fire that they follow. That's so mysterious and weird and intimidating. He moves into the temple, and his presence is so palatable that nobody wants to go there. Like people are afraid to enter into his presence. You get the idea, right? On and on. Two things that we always seem to experience: mystery and terror. So what are your experiences? I mean, think about it. Usually for most human beings, whether it's ground of being or hyper being or God as event, it still is characterized by one of these two things: mystery or terror. And then comes Jesus. And do you see the power of Immanuel? Do you see the power of this? Jesus is the incarnation of God. He tells us who God is. So if we wrestle with questions of what is God like, the answer is this. This is God with us. This is what God is like. This is who he is. He is the one that informs us about God's heart and who he is. This is who we look at. And so we discover that he jokes. And he hangs out with all kinds of people that some people think he shouldn't hang out with. And he tells crazy stories that are sometimes difficult to understand but really meaningful. And he heals people, and he guides people, and he loves people, and he welcomes people, and he extends grace to people, and he lavishes people with love. That's what we see. So when God says, do you want to know who I am? This is what he shows us. Through Immanuel, God is clearing up the confusion about who he is. He's removing the mystery and taking away the terror. He's saying, this is who I am. And let me just tell you, there is something radically different that takes place in our hearts, in our lives, when we move from these vague experiences of God to a relationship with Jesus. It's different. And our thinking about God changes when we understand this is God with us. And the way we think about God is important. Why? Because it changes how we relate to God. Now let me shift gears. It matters how we think about God. But how God thinks about us is of infinitely greater importance. Agreed? Like, it's important that we think rightly about God, but we should probably know what God thinks of us, right? If God is God. Which brings us to the second word, with. I want to talk about the significance and the meaning of this word with. And let me just explain first. I know that when I speak, I have some funny habits, idiosyncrasies. I know these things because I have so-called friends who occasionally do impersonations of me. Some might call it mocking me. In fact, for instance, this Halloween, young leader around here, Connor Lee, he was me for Halloween. Yep. Walked around all youth group giving benedictions to students over their Halloween. I don't know why it's funny. Okay, can you get that thing off of there, right? So anyways, so I am well aware of my idiosyncrasies, okay? And so there's things, and so I've discovered that I have this habit that when I'm moving from one idea to another, like I'm building on an idea or I'm moving to another point, before I do that, I will look at all of you and I will say, are you with me? Right? I also say right a lot, and I realize that at the 9 o'clock service. But I say, are you with me, right? Are you with me? And what I'm saying when I say that is, are you tracking? Does this make enough sense that we can move on? Are we on the same page? Are we connecting? Are we together in this? That's an important thing for me to know that you're with me. Are you with me? Yes. All right, you're with me, right? Now, it goes beyond what I just described, though. Being with me, if I think about that, it's not just like, hey, we're tracking. There's a deeper level of this, right? Like if I say with a cause, are you with me in this cause? Are you joining me in this? That's more than just, are you tracking? That means I got skin in the game. That means I'm going to sacrifice resources. That means I'm going to partner with you. I'm going to lock arms with you. I'm going to journey with you. I'm going to battle with you, right? Being with somebody says, no, I am with you. Like I've got your back, right? That's what being, like, I am with you. Are you with me? You're with me, right? There's a different kind of with me. And it seems to indicate both presence and being for someone, right? I am present and I am for you. This is what God thinks about us. This is what God is thinking about you. Whether or not you think rightly about God, this is how God thinks about you. He is present and he is for you. In fact, if you look at the Bible, the writer of Genesis makes it very clear, and he keeps returning to this like eastward metaphor, insisting that something has gone terribly wrong with humanity, and that from the very beginning, humans have been moving in the wrong direction as it relates to God. This is where John Steinbeck gets the title of his great novel, East of Eden, that humanity is moving away from God. And then what do we see in the scriptures? What do we see in the Bible? What do we see as God's heart towards people? Well, it's really fascinating because the opening pages show God walking in a garden with them. And then a few chapters later, we see that there's this tabernacle, this tent of meeting that stays right in the middle of their camp. And then as they travel along, they take that with them, and God is always in their presence. And then the people of Israel, when they go to war, the Ark of the Covenant is always at the center of the army of Israel. It's always carried with them into battle. And when they get to Jerusalem, and they build a great city, at the center of the city is the temple of God, and his presence is known by all the people. And then we come to Immanuel. And all of these images point to this overwhelming passion of God's heart that he wants to be with us. With us. Like, Moses puts on a veil to hide his face to see God, but God puts on flesh so that he can come be with us. He wants to be with us. And it's not like, I just want to be along for the ride. It's because when God is with you, he is for you. Like God cannot help but be for you if he is present with you. The presence of God in your life will automatically result in him being for you. If you ever doubt this, if you're ever discouraged, if you're ever unclear about what's available to you, there's this letter in the New Testament called Romans. And halfway through the book of Romans, there's chapter 8. And in chapter 8, the Apostle Paul, he's writing this letter to the church at Rome, and he has this beautiful chapter where he builds a case that it's essentially all that we have available to us because of the very presence of Jesus. Just the fact that Jesus is present, this is what that means for us in this life and beyond what we can see. And he describes all of this. And in fact, you can't read it without being convinced that God is on your side. But then there's this crescendo, and in verse 31, he comes to this point where he says, what can we say to these things? What shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? It's a rhetorical question, by the way, because he's proven the answer. God is so for us that nobody could be against us. God is for us. Why? Because God is with us. Which brings us to the final word of this. Immanuel is God with who? Us, right? God with us. This God who has cleared up the confusion in Jesus and is present with us is one of the most beautiful things that we can understand. It means that God is not mistaken about who we are. He knows us. It's not like God only sees us on like our social media profiles. Like God's like looking, he's like, swipe left, swipe right. Like I like them, I don't like them, right? You're going to hell, you're going to heaven. It's not like, right? Let me just say this. God's not going to meet you in person and be like, well, I'm really surprised. I thought you'd be different in person. I thought you'd be taller. I don't know. Your hobbies looked way more interesting online than they do in person. God will never say that to us, right? Because he knows us. In fact, that's the beauty of this. Like God is with us, and the whole story of Immanuel is God entering into the mess, and he surrounds himself with people who are just as messed up as you are, and me, by the way, all of us. Like Jesus, the story of Jesus is that he goes and hangs out with all these people who are just people which means this: God being present and God being for isn't for some privileged group of people who are behaving in some particular way. That means God is present and for us, all of us. It's like we say to God, "Are you with me?" And God says, "I am with you." You. And he doesn't just tolerate us. I think sometimes our overemphasis on all of our brokenness and our need for grace has sometimes reduced grace to just being God's tolerance of us. Like, I mean, if it wasn't for God, it really wouldn't be worth much. Like, if it wasn't for his grace, like, I don't know, like, I don't even, like, God just kind of puts up with me. And we kind of find ourselves, many of us find ourselves living in this, like, we're barely acceptable. And thank goodness for God's grace, because otherwise But God does not just simply tolerate us. He loves us, and he's for us. And I love C.S. Lewis in The Weight of Glory. He writes this. He says, "To be loved by God, not merely pitied, but delighted in as an artist delights in his work or a father in his son, it seems impossible, a weight or burden of glory which our thoughts can hardly sustain, but so it is." I love that. But so it is. And as much as we desire to be with God, God desires to be with us. And sometimes I think we hesitate to believe that. We think that's too human-based. Like, that sounds like God's needy to be with us. But let me just be clear. God has designed it this way from the beginning. He shows us who he is. He tells us what he's about. And it's all wrapped up in this word, Immanuel. God with us. And this is a blessing. It is an announcement. It's a proclamation that's being made. So because of that, I want to do something a little different. I want to close by, first of all, I want you just to say, "God is with me and for me" together. Would you just say that right now? God is with me and for me. Now, I want to make you a little more uncomfortable, and I want you to turn to somebody next to you or around you, and I want you to say to them, because sometimes a blessing or a proclamation needs to be proclaimed by someone else. Will you just say to somebody else, "God is with you and for you"? Will you do that right now? Scott, did you do it? Okay. I didn't see you do it, so. Okay. I'm not looking, I was just kidding. I'm like looking, gonna call you out. Can I just say this? I don't know a situation, I don't know a circumstance, I don't know a relationship, I don't know a tension, I don't know a fear, I don't know a worry that isn't radically transformed when we lean into and we hold on to the words, "God is with me and for me." Amen? Would you stand with me? May you be men and women who experience Immanuel. God is with you and for you. Amen? Amen. Love you guys. Have an amazing week. Celebrate Immanuel. We'll see you next Sunday. See you later.